Hi, welcome to the course titled Cooperative Individualism, the Third Way to the Just Society. My name is Ed Dodson. This course comes out of my own long journey to try to identify the principles for the just society. My readings over the years helped me to develop this course, and I hope that you're going to find it both entertaining and informative, and perhaps most important, that it'll cause you to really think differently about the world than you have up to this point. The course offers an introduction to what is a unique socio-political philosophy known as cooperative individualism, and I support the proposition that the principles of cooperative individualism are essential to the establishment of just societies. Essentially, this means that without these principles in place, no society can become truly just. So let's take a look at the principles at work, and this will be the beginning of the course that you can really think about how these principles interact with one another and whether or not they meet an objective test of justice. So in this first lesson, I'll introduce the principles of cooperative individualism. We'll discuss throughout the course how these principles relate to fundamental human rights. Additionally, over several lessons, we'll examine a new perspective on the left-right paradigm. Liberalism is a term used to describe the institutions and arrangements that evolved in the United States during the 20th century. Other republics, to a greater or lesser extent, governed according to written law and the protection of civil and human rights, are referred to as social democracies or democratic socialist societies. So in this course, I will offer an interpretation of liberalism as a self-limiting set of policy choices on how to organize a society, and explain why liberalism is incapable of protecting individual liberty or preventing injustice. I will introduce you to the ideas of important, some prominent, and some relatively obscure contributors to the evolution of cooperative individualism as a framework for just socio-political arrangements and institutions. I identify Thomas Paine as the architect of cooperative individualism, Henry George as a major figure of the 19th century, and Mortimer J. Adler as a primary contributor during the 20th century. The online project I established in 1977 as the School of Cooperative Individualism contains writings by these and many other authors. The course will conclude with a discussion of a paper I wrote titled The Democratic Imperative. This paper examines the structure of societies, the basis of claims to sovereignty over people and territory, the nature of citizenship, the restructuring of government, issues relating to private wants and public needs, and questions of economic rights. My own journey of discovery began when, as a young high school student, very interested in history, a teacher recommended that I read Paine's book, Rights of Man. Then, during my undergraduate years, I read several books by the philosopher Mortimer J. Adler. In particular, The Common Sense of Politics really influenced me. And a few years later, a city planner in Pennsylvania pointed me to the writings of Henry George for their insights into how tax policies affect economic outcomes. George actually contributed much more than that. Slowly, the world was beginning to make sense to me as I continued my studies. At the end of the 1970s, I decided it was time to continue my formal education and began thinking about a graduate degree. By chance, I learned of the existence of an extension in Philadelphia of the Henry George School of Social Science, which offered a one-year program in political economy studying the works of Henry George. Then, at the end of my coursework, the director, George Collins, invited me to join the school's all-volunteer faculty. Teaching required continuous study to master the subject, and a few years later I began to work on a Master of Liberal Arts degree program at Temple University. What I learned teaching and during my own graduate studies was that few people had even a basic understanding of the history necessary for a deep appreciation of what writers such as Paine, Adler, and George were trying to convey. I decided to develop a semester-long introductory course titled The Search for the Just Society, which I began teaching at the Henry George School. The material for this course eventually served as the basis for a 3-volume work titled The Discovery of First Principles. The first 2 volumes of the book were published in 2001 and 2003. The 3rd volume I decided to make available online without charge, and it's on my website, the School of Cooperative Individualism, as we speak. Along the way, I was introduced to the philosophical principles of cooperative individualism. Where did that come from? Well, at a conference in 1994 held in Fairhope, Alabama, an historian named Paul Gaston explained that the town's origins as an experimental community were governed by these principles. As he talked, I realized that the ideals were very much those of Paine, Adler, and George. 3 years later, I launched an online education and research project that I titled the School of Cooperative Individualism. The purpose was and is to introduce others to the principles and history of cooperative individualism. As anyone who visits the website will learn, the project expanded over time to archive writings by authors holding diverse views on issues relating to political economy and the social sciences more generally. With this introduction, we begin our study by examining the very nature of principles. Principles are defined as, quote, basic truths, laws, or assumptions. Some principles can be tested by scientific experiment. However, where human behavior is concerned, we must rely far more on our moral sense of right and wrong, as well as our capacity to be objective where matters of rights common to all persons are to be secured and protected. The first principle of cooperative individualism comes from the observation of what all persons need, specifically, that all persons share the same species-specific characteristics and have a similar need for the goods. For example, adequate food, clothing, shelter, nurturing, medical care, education, leisure, culture, and civic involvement for a decent human existence. The second principle comes out of our need for association with one another. That we join together in society to enhance our ability to acquire such goods and for our mutual benefit and enjoyment. The third principle arises out of our mutual dependency on our planet for our survival, which at the same time recognizes the distinction between the planet as our commons and what we produce as the basis for claims to individual property. That the sources of the material goods necessary for our survival is the earth, equal access to which is the birthright of all persons, as is the full enjoyment of what individuals produce therefrom. The next 2 principles associated with cooperative individualism distinguish behavior that is legitimately within the realm of individual liberty and behavior described by John Locke by the term license, of which there are 2 forms, criminal and economic. That liberty is the basis for moral human behavior, inherent in which is the constraint that such behavior in no way infringes on the liberty of others. That human behavior falls outside the realm of liberty and within the realm of criminal license when such behavior violates the liberty of others. Societies continue to hold inconsistent views on what constitutes criminal behavior and what sort of penalties are appropriate to apply when such behavior occurs. The closest we have come to consensus is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on 10 December 1948. Article 25 states, "Everyone has the right to a standard living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." Unfortunately, even where societies have embraced this principle, the means of achieving the outcomes have in no society fully materialized. A fundamental reason is that the above and following principles of cooperative individualism are absent from the Universal Declaration. That the orderly functioning of society requires the granting to individuals of licenses that distribute privileges not enjoyed by others. To the extent such licenses come to have exchange value in the marketplace, this value is acknowledged to be socially created. Justice requires, therefore, that society collect this value as a fund for equal distribution to all members of society and/or for societal expenditures democratically agreed upon, and that a society is just the extent to which liberty is fully realized, equality of opportunity prevails, criminal license is appropriately penalized, the full exchange value of economic licenses is collected for distribution and/or societal use, and the wealth produced by one's individual labor, directly or indirectly with the assistance of capital goods, is protected as one's naturally rightful property and not subject to taxation or other forms of confiscation. We have with this reached the end of our first introductory lesson. I don't expect you to really fully grasp the principles that I've presented. I hope you will take some time to reread them, listen again, and begin to form your own sense of whether or not they make sense as a cohesive basis for forming societies that lead to just outcomes. And certainly the rest of the course will go into a great deal of detail on how these principles evolved in my own thinking, where they come from, and what I feel is the justification for proposing them as the necessary basis for just societies. Thank you.